What if I told you that the biggest fight between Steve Jobs and Bill Gates didn't actually start with Apple or Microsoft? It started in a quiet research lab owned by Xerox, years before Windows became the default, before the Macintosh changed personal computing, and long before most people even understood what a graphical interface was. Xerox had already built many of the ideas that would shape the modern computer, and somehow they failed to see what they had. To understand how crazy this story is, you have to remember what computers were like in the late 1970s. They weren't visual, they weren't intuitive, and they definitely weren't designed for everyday people. Instead of clicking on icons or opening apps, you had to type commands into a blank black screen. And if you didn't know the exact syntax, the computer simply wouldn't respond. There were no windows, no mouse, no interface, just a blinking cursor and a very steep learning curve. In other words, computers weren't tools for the public yet, they were tools for engineers. But while the rest of the world was still stuck in that command line era, something completely different was happening inside a research lab called Xerox PARC, because inside that building, engineers had already developed technologies that would later define modern computing. Graphical user interfaces with windows, icons, and menus. A mouse that allowed you to control the screen with simple hand movements. Pixel-based displays that made graphics possible. Editors where what you saw on the screen was exactly what you would get when printed. Ethernet networking, which allowed computers to connect and communicate each other. Even early versions of object-oriented programming, which would go on to shape how software is built today. They had already built the future, years, maybe even decades ahead of everyone else. And yet, Xerox didn't turn any of this into real products. The company still saw itself primarily as a photocopier business. And while their researchers were inventing revolutionary technology, the executives simply didn't understand its potential. Instead of pushing these ideas into the market, they treated them as experimental projects. Interesting, but not essential. So the future of computing just sat there, waiting for someone else to recognize its value. That someone else arrived in 1979, when a young Steve Jobs visited Xerox PARC with a small group of Apple engineers. The visit itself wasn't unusual. Xerox had invested in Apple, and, as part of the deal, allowed them to see some of the work being done in the lab. It was meant to be nothing more than a demonstration, a casual showcase of experimental ideas. But what Jobs saw during that visit would completely change the direction of personal computing. When Jobs looked at the system, he immediately realized how different it was from anything else that existed at the time. Instead of typing commands, you could move a cursor across the screen using a mouse, click on objects, open windows, and interact with the computer in a way that felt almost natural. It wasn't just more advanced, it was fundamentally easier to use, and that meant it had the potential to reach millions of people, not just specialists. At that moment, Jobs understood something that Xerox hadn't. This wasn't just a research project, it was the future of computing. And as he later put it, within 10 years, all computers would work like this. After returning to Apple, Jobs pushed his team to turn that vision into a real product. The first attempt was the Lisa, released in 1983. It introduced many of these concepts, but was too expensive for most people, and it ultimately failed commercially. However, the ideas behind it didn't disappear, they evolved. In 1984, Apple released the Macintosh, a computer that successfully brought the graphical user interface to a wider audience. For the first time, people could interact with computers visually, using a mouse instead of memorizing commands. And that shift fundamentally changed how humans and machines interacted. But Apple wasn't the only company paying attention. Bill Gates had already been working closely with Apple, developing software for the Macintosh, which meant he had direct access to this new way of interacting with computers. Unlike Jobs, who focused on creating a tightly controlled product experience, Gates saw an opportunity to build something much broader, a software platform that could run on many different machines. So instead of trying to compete directly with Apple's hardware, Microsoft began developing its own graphical operating system. In 1985, Microsoft released Windows 1.0, which was far from perfect, but it marked the beginning of a much bigger shift. Over the next few years, Microsoft continued improving the system, and by the time Windows 3.0 was released in 1990, graphical interfaces had become widely adopted. At that point, the transition was complete. The way we interact with computers today, clicking, dragging, opening windows, had become the global standard. Of course, this didn't happen without tension. At one point, Jobs accused Gates of copying Apple's ideas, but Gates responded with a now famous analogy, saying that it was more like they both had a rich neighbor named Xerox, and while he had tried to steal the TV, he discovered that Jobs had already taken it. It was a joke, but also an admission of what had really happened. Because in the end, the story isn't just about who invented what, it's about who actually turned those ideas into something the world could use. Xerox PARC PARC created many of the core technologies behind modern computing, but they never turned them into products. Apple transformed those ideas into user-friendly devices, and Microsoft scaled them into a global ecosystem. And that leads to the most important takeaway. Having a groundbreaking idea isn't enough on its own. What truly matters is execution, the ability to take that idea, refine it, and bring it into the real world at the right time. Because history doesn't remember who had the idea first, it remembers who made it matter.